In early July 1835, Joseph Smith and other Mormons purchased 4 Egyptian mummies from Michael Chandler, a traveling antiques dealer from the East. According to Oliver Cowdery, the acquisition included 2 rolls of papyrus and 2 or 3 other small pieces of papyrus with astronomical calculations, epitaphs, etc. Additionally, he said, the Egyptian records, or rather the writings of Abraham and Joseph, are beautifully written on papyrus with black and a small part red ink or paint, in perfect preservation. After Joseph Smith's death, the mummies and Egyptian papyri were sold to Abel Combs in 1856, who immediately sold a large portion of the collection to the St. Louis Museum, which then sold it to the Woods Museum in Chicago, where they were evidently destroyed in the Great Fire of 1871. When about a dozen fragments of Joseph Smith's Egyptian papyri were discovered in the New York Metropolitan Museum and turned over to the LDS Church in 1967, it was quickly discovered that the group of documents not only included facsimile 1 of the Book of Abraham, but one of the fragments contained the hieratic characters that appear in the margins of the 3 Kirtland translation documents, that they have been copied sequentially from the first 4 lines of what archivists have designated as Joseph Smith Papyrus 11. It was obvious to many that the source of the Book of Abraham had been found.
Hi, I'm Dan Vogel. When Egyptologists translated the characters on this portion of the papyrus, it said nothing about Abraham, but instead gave instructions on how the mummy was to be wrapped. Game over? Well, not quite. Mormon apologists began immediately to invent excuses to divert attention away from the obvious truth. In previous videos, I discussed how the apologists have tried to obscure the meaning of the characters in the columns of the translation documents, claiming that they were added as mere decoration or as a method of organizing the English paragraphs. This was shown to be totally without merit. Another strategy has been to claim that the source of the Book of Abraham is still lost and was probably destroyed in the 1871 Chicago fire. In this video, I will discuss the claims of Hugh Nibley in the 1970s and John Gee and Carrie Milstein more recently that the Book of Abraham did not come from the breathing permit of Hor, but actually came from a now lost portion of the papyrus. Once again, we find that their handling of the sources is seriously flawed and colored by apologetic necessity.
Shortly after the fragments were discovered, Brigham Young University professor and chief apologist Hugh Nibley argued that the recently discovered fragments of the Book of Breathings were not the source of the Book of Abraham. In his 1975 book, The Message of the Joseph Smith Papyri, an Egyptian endowment, he argued, "The prophet Joseph himself has supplied us with conclusive evidence that the manuscript today identified as the Book of Breathings, Joseph Smith Papyri 10 and 11, was not, in his opinion, the source of the Book of Abraham, for he has furnished a clear and specific description of the latter. The record of Abraham and Joseph, found with the mummies, is 1. Beautifully written on papyrus with black, and 2. A small part red ink or paint, 3. In perfect preservation. Because the Book of Breathings didn't have red ink and was badly damaged, Nibley concluded that it wasn't the source of the Book of Abraham." Nibley quoted from the History of the Church, where it appeared Joseph Smith was speaking, but actually it was silently quoting Oliver Cowdery's description of the papyri in the December 1835 issue of the Messenger and Advocate, where in a letter to William Fry he stated, "Upon the subject of the Egyptian records, or rather the writings of Abraham and Joseph, I may say a few words. This record is beautifully written on papyrus with black and a small part red ink or paint, in perfect preservation." Cowdery was giving a general description of both scrolls, one purportedly containing the record of Abraham and the other the record of Joseph, the latter of which contains some writing in red ink. In describing the papyri, Cowdery was influenced by an affidavit that Chandler had obtained from several medical doctors in Philadelphia. The features of some of these mummies are in perfect expression. The papyrus, covered with black or red ink or paint, in excellent preservation, are very interesting. In 1975, H. Michael Marquardt, a well-known scholar of the Book of Abraham and early Mormon history, responded to Nibley's argument. The two rolls of papyri that were in Joseph Smith's possession were the Ta Sherp Min papyrus, beautifully written for a woman with some red ink, and the Book of Breathings papyrus, written for a man named Hor, with black ink only. Oliver Cowdery wrote in terms of both records and not the record of Abraham alone. The statement used by Dr. Nibley does not disqualify Joseph Smith Papyrus 11 as a candidate for the source of the Book of Abraham, as he would like us to believe. The idea that Joseph Smith and or Oliver Cowdery were describing another papyrus, which has since been lost, is certainly not correct. For good reason, Nibley never responded to this criticism. A new version of the missing papyrus theory has been devised by apologists John Gee and Kerry Muhlestein. According to this apologetic, the Book of Abraham didn't come from the fragments of the Book of Breathings, discovered in the 1960s as both Mormons and non-Mormons have assumed, but rather from a text that followed the Book of Breathings on an extra-long roll that was sold to the Woods Museum in Chicago and subsequently destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. To support this theory, these apologists refer to eyewitness testimony that identifies the long scroll as the source of the Book of Abraham rather than the fragments, which Joseph Smith had mounted on large pieces of paper about 1837 to help preserve them. These large pieces of paper, some of which contained plans for the Kirtland Temple and a map of northern Ohio, were at some point cut into smaller pieces and placed under glass in picture frames. In his 2017 book, An Introduction to the Book of Abraham, Gee asserted, "The 19th century eyewitnesses, both Mormon and non-Mormon, favorable and hostile to the church, agree that the Book of Abraham was translated from a long roll of papyrus that was still a long roll in the 1840s and 50s. The current fragments of the Joseph Smith papyri, however, were all mounted on heavy paper and placed in glass frames in 1837. None of them can be the long roll described in the 1840s and 1850s. So these fragments are specifically not the source of the Book of Abraham, according to the eyewitnesses." In a YouTube video published on the 2nd of April 2013 on the Fair Mormon channel, Muhlestein similarly explained,
"As we look through all of the accounts, people who knew Joseph Smith and saw the papyri fragments and the rolls while he was alive and heard him or his mother talk about them, he had two rolls, one of them a long roll, and that's the one that Joseph and others refer to as the source of the Book of Abraham. That roll was destroyed in the Chicago fire. And what we can document is that he had already mounted some under glass before people were saying that he's translating from the long roll. So the fragments that we have, they're not what others were saying and what Joseph Smith was saying he was translating from. Anyone who tells you that Joseph Smith is translating from the text around facsimile 1 on the small fragment that we have is just flying in the face of the historical accounts that tell us the source is the long scroll."
In an essay published in 2016 in the Journal of Mormon History, titled Papyri and Presumptions, a careful examination of the eyewitness accounts associated with the Joseph Smith papyri, Muhlestein discussed the sources upon which his long scroll theory is based, and asserted, "While most of the accounts do not paint a fully clear picture, taken together the only scenario that can reconcile all the accounts is that the long scroll was the source of the Book of Abraham. Differentiating between the mounted fragments and the longer rolls is an important component to understanding what eyewitnesses were referring to when they spoke of the source of the Book of Abraham." The problem with Muhlstein's method is that none of the eyewitnesses, as we shall see, possessed the knowledge necessary to verify Gee's and Muhlstein's theory. Most were simply expressing an assumption based on Joseph Smith's identification of one scroll as the writings of Abraham and the other as the writings of Joseph. No one distinguished between the fragments under the glass and the scroll as the source of the Book of Abraham. Thus, Muhlestein and Gee assigned to these casual observers a knowledge they most certainly did not have. Before we consider Milstein's and Guy's witnesses, it is important to understand that their theory requires several highly improbable assumptions. The main assumption is that the record of Abraham followed the Book of Breathings on the same roll. For entirely apologetic reasons, Guy has asserted that facsimile 3 came from the middle of a long roll, and that the Hor scroll was originally 320 centimeters, or about 10 feet long. In a 2000 essay, John Guy asserted that the Scroll of Hor was a roll of some size, estimated original dimensions 320 by 11 centimeters, or about 10 feet. The outer leaves, separated and mounted in Kirtland in 1836, remain as Joseph Smith Papyrus 1, 11, and 10, in that order from right to left. This roll contains the so-called Book of Breathings made by Isis, and at least one other text. The relationship of this roll to Papyrus Louvre 3284 leads us to expect that there would have been two other columns of text on the roll of Hor's papyrus, in addition to the vignette preserved as facsimile 3 in the Book of Abraham. This argues for more than one text on the roll. Thus, we would expect more to have remained on the roll than the two columns of text from the Book of Breathings and the vignette, or facsimile 3. After giving examples of scrolls containing more than one record, Guy argues, just because the preserved sections of the Joseph Smith papyri are funerary in nature does not mean that they could not have had other texts, either on the verso or on missing sections of the rolls. Obviously, Guy believes the one other text on the scroll following Hor's Book of Breathings was the Book of Abraham. University of Chicago Egyptologist Robert Rittner responded to Guy in 2011, stating that 320 centimeters is the average length of a blank papyrus roll as manufactured in the Ptolemaic era, not the length of the known books of breathing copied on sections cut from such rolls. Rittner further stated that books of breathings are of a uniform pattern, and as a result of this uniformity, the original size of the papyrus is not in doubt. With textual restorations and the now lost facsimile 3, the papyrus will have measured about 150 to 155 centimeters, or 59 to 61 inches long. In a 2000 interview, Rittner explained, "The most that is missing from this text is simply 2 columns worth of Egyptian hieratic text and possibly a small vignette. But other than that, there would be nothing more that would inflate its length beyond its current size." Like Guy, Milstein has similarly argued that large scrolls could contain several texts with several different original authors. However, the mere fact that some Egyptian papyri contain more than one book is no reason to assert that the breathing permit of Hor included an alien text like the Book of Abraham, which historians know as the fallacy of possible proof. As historian David Hackett Fisher explains, the fallacy of possible proof consists in an attempt to demonstrate that a factual statement is true or false by establishing the possibility of its truth or falsity. Valid empirical proof requires not merely the establishment of possibility, but an estimate of probability. In this instance, the probability that Joseph Smith's Book of Breathings prefaced another unrelated text from a foreign author, like the Book of Abraham, is non-existent. Egyptologist Mark Kuhnen, an expert in funerary texts, also responded to Guy's and Milstein's long scroll theory. Some writers have suggested that the actual text of the Book of Abraham was not inscribed on the fragments rediscovered in 1966, but on a portion of the papyrus scroll still missing. Unquestionably, Joseph Smith Papyrus 1, 10, and 11 were originally longer. A comparison with Papyrus Louvre N 3158, which contains the most complete version extant of the document of breathing made by Isis, indicates that as many as 3 to 4 columns of hieratic text may be missing between the end of Joseph Smith Papyrus 10 and the segment Smith identified as the Book of Abraham facsimile 3. Finally, some writers have rightly pointed out that papyri from Greco-Roman Egypt are sometimes inscribed with more than one text. No one denies that other funerary and or ritual compositions were sometimes appended to a Book of the Dead or other funerary compositions. However, concluding that a record of Abraham or any other text foreign to the Ptolemaic Egyptian funerary and/or liturgical practice was once attached to the Joseph Smith Papyri is an assertion not based upon widely accepted Egyptological analysis. Rittner and Guy agree that the Hor Papyrus originally included at least 2 additional columns of hieratic text and possibly another vignette between Joseph Smith Papyrus 10 and Facsimile 3, while Koonin thinks that 3 or 4 columns of hieratic text may be missing. This means that the Hor Papyrus, prior to being damaged, was about 5 feet long, possibly more. The surviving fragments from this scroll, now in the LDS Church History Library, measure lengthwise approximately as follows. Thus we have 3 fragments that together measure about 66 centimeters or 26 inches, which means that there could have been a scroll of about 84 to 89 centimeters or roughly 3 feet long in addition to the 3 mounted fragments. This was probably the long roll that some of Guy's and Muhlstein's witnesses saw. This approximately 3-foot roll was no doubt among the Egyptian relics sold to Abel Combs on the 26th of May 1856, who immediately sold a portion of the collection to the St. Louis Museum, where they were placed on display. Later the same year, Gustav Seeforth, a visiting professor at nearby Concordia Seminary, described the contents of the Joseph Smith collection for the museum's catalog and found that the purported Abraham Papyrus roll was not a record, as Joseph Smith had claimed, but an invocation to the deity Osiris, in which occurs the name of the person, Horus, and a picture of the attendant spirits introducing the dead to the judge, Osiris. Seeforth no doubt described Facsimile 3 of the Book of Abraham, which only survives through a poorly rendered engraving. According to Joseph Smith, the image represents Abraham sitting upon Pharaoh's throne, reasoning upon the principles of astronomy. Smith further explained that the female figure standing behind the throne is Pharaoh, while the other female figure is a prince, followed by a waiter and a slave. Of course, Smith was completely wrong. Actually, this vignette depicts the owner of the scroll, Hor, being presented by Maat and Anubis to Osiris, who sits on the throne with Isis standing behind him. According to Joseph Smith, the figure between Maat and Anubis is Shulam, one of the king's principal waiters as represented by the characters above his hand. Rittner translates these characters as the Osiris Hor, justified forever. Part of the invocation below the scene reads, according to Rittner, "Grant salvation to the Osiris Hor, the justified." There can be no doubt, therefore, that the papyrus roll Seeforth had described in 1856, containing a judgment scene and the name Horus, the Latin equivalent of Hor, was the approximately 3-foot roll that ended with Facsimile 3. This roll was evidently sold to the Woods Museum in Chicago, along with the other Egyptian artifacts, and destroyed in the fire of 1871. Guy's and Muhlstein's assertion that this lost scroll of approximately 3 feet was actually about 8 feet long and contained an alien text that condemned everything in the preceding text, the Egyptian religion, gods, and Pharaoh, is highly improbable to say the least. Do Guy and Muhlstein want us to believe a real Book of Joseph was attached to the end of the Ta-Sheret Min Book of the Dead as well? I seriously doubt they have thought through the implications of their desperate apologetics. Another problem the Muhlstein-Guy theory has to overcome is that the text of the Book of Abraham twice refers to the vignette, supposedly depicting Abraham upon an altar and an idolatrous priest attempting to sacrifice him, which Egyptologists recognize as the reanimation of Osiris. Abraham chapter 1 verse 12 reads, "And that you may have a knowledge of this altar, I will refer you to the representation at the commencement of this record." And in Abraham chapter 1 verse 14, this statement, "That you may have an understanding of these gods, I have given you the fashion of them in the figures at the beginning." This creates a serious problem for the Muhlstein-Guy theory. Indeed, it is difficult to explain how the text of the Book of Abraham could refer to the unrelated opening vignette of the Book of Breathings as the commencement of this record. Another problem is that the vignette is associated with books of breathing from the Ptolemaic era, between about 238 and 153 BCE, not from Abraham's day. In his recent book, An Introduction to the Book of Abraham, Guy acknowledged this problem, but then attempted an apologetic escape that fails miserably. Since the papyri came from the Ptolemaic period, 1500 years after Abraham, the style of pictures will not have been the same style as was current in Abraham's day. Abraham may not have included any illustrations in his original account. The references to the facsimiles within the text of the Book of Abraham seem to have been 19th century editorial insertions. The earliest manuscript we have shows that the phrase, "I will refer you to the representation that is at the commencement of this record," from Abraham 1:12, was squished in 2 lines of smaller handwriting in the space at the end of the paragraph between Abraham 1:12 and 1:13. As previously discussed in another video, the Frederick G. Williams document is not the earliest manuscript, but rather was created simultaneously with Warren Parrish's manuscript as Joseph Smith dictated in November 1835. Although there was some hesitation about the wording, the reference to facsimile 1 was not a later insertion. The characterization that the text is squished in 2 lines of smaller handwriting in the space at the end of the paragraph is inaccurate. Because this sheet was unlined, there is a general upward slant to Williams' lines, especially at the end of paragraphs. The only thing that is apparent is that the last line signals an insertion, since it was inserted into the space created by the upward angle of the previous line. The question is where the insertion begins. Cutting out the entire reference to the altar doesn't work, because it would create too much space between paragraphs, which wasn't Williams' practice. Guy suggested that Williams inserted the phrase, "I will refer you to the representation that is at the commencement of this record," probably because the line starts to curve upward at that point. However, since other paragraphs in the Williams document also end with a similar upward angle, it provides no clue as to where the insertion begins. Moreover, Guy's suggestion doesn't make grammatical sense. According to Guy, Joseph Smith originally ended the sentence abruptly, leaving it incomplete, and that you may have a knowledge of this altar. To maintain coherence, the text probably originally ended at the word representation, so that it read, "And that you may have a knowledge of this altar, I will refer you to the representation," which was obvious to those in the room with Joseph Smith. At the same time, Parrish wrote the same words on the last 3 lines of page 2 of his manuscript. Later, Williams added the phrase, "that is at the commencement of this record," for clarification. Parrish's document demonstrates that there was apparently some hesitation about the wording of this clarification. He first wrote, "that is lying before you." While this was true for Joseph Smith and his scribes, it would not be true for future readers of the published text. Parrish therefore cancelled these words and then added in the bottom margin of the page, "at the commencement of this record." Williams evidently made his insertion after the wording had been decided. At any rate, Guy's apologetic fails. His explanation for the reference in Abraham chapter 1 verse 14, which appears at the top of page 2 in the Williams document, also fails for similar reasons. Concerning this passage, Guy asserts, Abraham 1:14 was added in a similar hand, squeezed into the margin at the top of the page, above the header, ignoring the ruled left margin. However, there is no reason to believe these lines were inserted later. This page, like the previous one, is unruled, so there is no top margin that would have been left blank. Williams, in fact, began all his pages at the top. The left margin line is hand-drawn, in pencil, and doesn't appear to extend above the first character, which suggests that it was drawn after the text. Page 4 also begins without observing the right margin, and each successive line moves a little to the right, making room for the first character that begins the 5th line. Contrary to Guy's assertion, the handwriting of the passage in question is not smaller or cramped in any way. Most importantly, Parrish, who was writing at the same time, recorded the passage in the middle of his page 3, without any disturbance. Guy concludes his apologetic by declaring, "The Book of Abraham actually reads smoothly without these additions. Thus, these statements in the text seem to be 19th century additions approved by, if not made by, Joseph Smith. This can only be true if the first reference to facsimile 1 was completely gone, which, as we saw, leaves too much space between paragraphs." Guy's apologetic serves as an example of how a failing theory often requires additional assumptions supported by other unlikely theories to explain away adverse evidence. Unfortunately, the Joseph Smith Papers editors in Volume 5 of the Documents series, as well as Volume 4 in the Revelations and Translations series, have followed Guy's interpretation of the two passages in the Williams document. In the latter volume, which is an otherwise excellent scholarly edition of the Book of Abraham and related manuscripts, Robin Jensen and Brian Hauglid were led to make an incorrect supposition in their introduction to the Williams document, stating that the two insertions were silently incorporated in Parrish's shorter document and that at least parts of the two manuscripts were not created simultaneously. Apparently, these Mormon interpreters want to divorce the Book of Abraham from the Egyptian papyri for different reasons than Guy and Milstein. In a recent interview, Robin Jensen stated, "Joseph Smith received revelation for the text of the Book of Abraham. He may have, through that revelation, made assumptions about where the text came from. It could be that Joseph Smith assumed that he was translating from the papyri when he was not, in fact, translating from the papyri. We don't know in the revelatory process how much of this is Joseph Smith and how much of it is the divine. So apparently Jensen believes the Book of Abraham came to Joseph Smith as a revelation, and because he thought it was a translation of the Breathing Permit of Hor, he added the two references to facsimile 1 by mistake." However, this new apologetic fails for the same reason as Guy's and Milstein's apologetic. Without supportive evidence that the two references to facsimile 1 were insertions, the only thing left is apologetic necessity and wishful thinking. To set up his argument that the witnesses identified the long roll as the source of the Book of Abraham, rather than the mounted fragments which contained the Breathing Permit, Milstein had to establish a probable time for when the fragments were mounted. For this, he relied heavily on the late reminiscence of Luman Shurtleff, who said that he toured the Kirtland Temple in 1837 and that he looked at the parchment or papyrus, which he apparently described as sheets of about 8 by 12 inches. Although not clearly stated, Milstein believes Shurtleff described the mounted fragments. However, the clearest reference to the fragments being mounted dates to 1840, and although it was published closer to the time of reporting, Milstein avoided quoting it for obvious reasons. An unnamed reporter visited Joseph Smith in Commerce, later Nauvoo, Illinois, in April 1840 and saw the Egyptian artifacts. After viewing the mummies, this reporter said Joseph Smith walked to a secretary on the opposite side of the room and drew out several frames covered with glass, under which were numerous fragments of Egyptian papyrus, on which, as usual, a great variety of hieroglyphical characters had been imprinted. They have been unrolled and preserved with great labor and care. Joseph Smith said, "My time has hitherto been too much taken up to translate the whole of them, but I will show you how I interpret certain parts. There," said he, pointing to a particular character, "that is the signature of the patriarch Abraham." While this early source verifies the preservation of fragments under glass, it also challenges the Milstein-Guy theory in locating Abraham's signature on one of the mounted fragments. Joseph Smith may have pointed to the second character in the right-hand column of Joseph Smith Papyrus 11 as the signature of Abraham. The first two characters have since flaked off, but W. W. Phelps copied them in the margin of his translation manuscript and keyed the second character to the name Abraham. The same two characters appeared at the end of the three alphabets, where the second character was also identified with Abraham. A similar account was given by future mayor of Boston, Josiah Quincy, who visited Joseph Smith in Nauvoo in 1844 and later reported, "Some parchments inscribed with hieroglyphics were then offered us. They were preserved under glass and handled with great respect. That is a handwriting of Abraham, the father of the faithful, said the prophet. In the forepart of his essay, Milstein unwittingly undermined his own thesis when he tried to head off criticism by mentioning that many of his witnesses made unwarranted assumptions about the scrolls, often assigning the penmanship to Abraham and Joseph, and assumed that an entire scroll contained just one text authored by just one person. Milstein evidently includes Joseph Smith among those making incorrect assumptions about the papyri, which renders any argument resting on a distinction between the scroll and the mounted fragments meaningless. Sidestepping these challenging sources, Milstein instead quoted Luhmann Shurtleff's 1850s reminiscence for evidence that a number of fragments had been cut and mounted already by the end of 1837. However, as previously mentioned, Shurtleff's account is unclear as to what he saw. The parchment, he said, appeared to be made of fine linen cloth, starched or sized with some kind of gum, then ironed smooth. At this point, Shurtleff's account confusingly switches to the plural when he states, "These sheets were about 8 by 12 inches. They were rolled, put in a gum case, and laid on the breast of the leading men of the Egyptians." The use of the plural sheets therefore appears to be a general statement about the practice of the Egyptians, not specifically about his viewing of the Joseph Smith papyrus. He then switches back to the singular. When the mummies were found, this record was on his breast, evidently referring to the one male mummy among the 4 that Joseph Smith procured in July 1835. He then stated it was from this record that the Pearl of Great Price was translated by the prophet. Apparently, Shurtleff thought the 8 by 12 sheet was the complete record of Abraham, which is exactly the opposite of what Milstein is trying to establish. Milstein attempts to extricate himself from this obvious problem by arguing that Shurtleff does not discuss whether the long rolls or sheets of papyrus were the source of the Book of Abraham, but rather associates the whole of the papyrus that came with the mummies as the source. However, this is not based on a careful reading, for Shurtleff never mentioned the long scroll, but rather stated quite clearly that the 8 by 12 sheet was rolled up and placed on the breast of the male mummy. While Milstein drew on Shurtleff's testimony to establish the date when the fragments were mounted, and did not intend to use him as one of his witnesses, we can already see how he mishandles and manipulates his sources. The remainder of this video examines each of Milstein's 7 witnesses. The first account is an 1897 second-hand report that Henry Tressler, while in Missouri in 1838, saw the rolls of papyrus from which the Pearl of Great Price was translated and procured a piece of the bandage that was wrapped around one of the mummies exhibited by Mr. Chandler. Nothing specific should be drawn from such a source. Nevertheless, Milstein argues, while Tressler's biographer does not appear to be trying to distinguish between the papyrus fragments and rolls, he is specific that, after having spoke with Joseph Smith about the antiquities, Tressler recounted that the rolls or scrolls were the source of the Book of Abraham. Who knows what exactly Tressler told Mormon missionary Foster W. Jones, who briefly summarized what the 86-year-old Tressler said during a 3-hour interview. It is therefore unclear if Tressler or Jones connected the scrolls, plural, with the Mormon scripture. There is no detail of what Tressler saw or what he had been told about the Egyptian documents. He may have very well seen facsimile 3 on one of the scrolls and made assumptions, but there is no distinction between the mounted fragments and the scrolls as the source of the Book of Abraham. Tressler is therefore a non-witness for the Milstein-Gee theory. In 1848, William I. Appleby recorded in his journal, under the date 5th of May, 1841, that he visited Joseph Smith in Nauvoo and saw the rolls of papyrus and the writings thereon, taken from off the bosom of the male mummy, having some of the writings of ancient Abraham and of Joseph that was sold into Egypt. Appleby did his best to describe the 2 scrolls in detail from memory. The writings are chiefly in the Egyptian language, with the exception of a little Hebrew. I believe they give a description of some of the scenes in ancient Egypt, of their worship, their idol gods, etc. The writings are beautiful and plain, composed of red and black inks. There is a perceptible difference between the writings. Joseph appears to have been the best scribe. There are also representations of men, beasts, birds, idols, and oxen attached to a kind of plow. a female guiding it. Also, the serpent, when he beguiled Eve. He appears with 2 legs erect in the form and appearance of a man, but his head in the form and representing the serpent, with his forked tongue extended. Milstein realizes that much of what Appleby described as being on the scrolls was actually on the fragments under glass, which creates a problem for his theory, and so he labors to make it seem like Appleby described something else. Milstein, for example, quibbles about Appleby's description of the walking serpent having his forked tongue extended, whereas on the fragment attributed to ancient Joseph, the serpent's tongue is not extended. Thus he argues, while the papyri fragments we now have match some of those descriptions, such as a plowing scene in Joseph Smith Papyrus 2, many of the scenes are not found on any of the extant fragments. However, if we grant that Appleby was not looking at the papyri when he wrote his account, his descriptions of the extant documents are reasonably accurate. Another problem is that while Appleby's journal entry is dated the 5th of May, 1841, it was actually written in 1848 from an earlier version, which was edited and supplemented by the text of the Book of Abraham published in the Times and Seasons in 1842. An earlier version of Appleby's account of his seeing the Egyptian papyri was published on the 10th of September 1841 in the Christian Observer in London, England, under the title Journal of a Mormon. The part about the snake with a forked tongue is missing. Given the lapse of time, the description of the snake's forked tongue is just the kind of thing a faulty memory might supply. Milstein concedes that Appleby describes things on the papyri that are actually on the fragments that we now have, such as birds, but he quibbles that we cannot tell for sure what Appleby saw, and beasts, but quibbles it is not the most obvious description of a lion or ox. These kinds of comments don't instill confidence in Milstein's scholarship or objectivity. There are plenty of birds and beasts to more than satisfy Appleby's description. He also described Abraham on the altar with a dove over the person, and there are several obvious hawks. And certainly there is a large lion sitting in the middle of Joseph Smith Papyrus 3, and there are many human-shaped figures with heads of animals. These figures no doubt reminded Appleby and others of the strange-looking beasts described in the Book of Revelation, especially since Cowdery had described the vignette on Joseph Smith Papyrus 3 as the Last Judgment. Milstein goes so far as to claim that none of the figures in the extant papyri are likely to be described as idols, though it is difficult to know what Appleby would have given that label. Yet, Appleby, and Joseph Smith for that matter, described Abraham bound on the altar with several idol gods standing around it, which we know as canopic jars. These same 4 idol gods appear on Joseph Smith Papyrus 3. While it is quite possible for Appleby to have described parts of the papyri which we no longer have, there is no reason to conclude that he did. On the contrary, it is clear that he described scenes that we know were among the fragments, as if they were on the intact scrolls. Thus, Appleby plainly states that he saw the rolls of papyrus and the writings thereon, including the idolatrous priest Elkanah, who attempted to offer up Abraham as a sacrifice to their idol gods in Egypt, as represented by the altar, etc., before referred to. Appleby therefore provides us with an example of where a witness might not distinguish between the scrolls and the mounted fragments as the source of the Book of Abraham, which means that the apologetic use of such sources is deeply flawed. Shortly after visiting Joseph Smith's mother, Lucy, and viewing the mummies and papyri in Nauvoo in 1843, Charlotte Haven wrote to her own mother and described her experience. She said Mother Smith opened a long roll of manuscript, saying it was the writing of Abraham and Isaac, written in Hebrew and Sanskrit. This account seems fanciful, if not totally inaccurate. Milstein didn't quote the next sentence, but it also seems fictitious. She read several minutes from it as if it were English. Nobody believes Lucy Smith could read Hebrew, Sanskrit, or Egyptian. Nevertheless, from this, Milstein argues, this is after the fragments we now have were mounted, indicating that the scroll, rather than the fragments, were being designated as containing the writings of Abraham. This conclusion doesn't necessarily follow, since it is entirely possible for Lucy Smith to have made the statement about the scroll as Haven reported without excluding the fragments as the source of the Book of Abraham. She only identified the roll as the writing of Abraham, not the source of the published Book of Abraham. There is nothing to indicate that the long roll was anything more than the approximately 3-foot scroll containing the end section of Hore's Book of Breathings. As previously mentioned, Milstein conceded that many of his witnesses made unwarranted assumptions about the scrolls, often assigning the penmanship to Abraham and Joseph, and assumed an entire scroll contained just one text, authored by just one person. Haven didn't mention the fragments, but she may have seen them. According to Haven, Lucy began interpreting the images on another roll. One was Mother Eve being tempted by the serpent, who, the serpent I mean, was standing on the tip of his tail, which, with his 2 legs, formed a tripod, and had his head in Eve's ear. I said, "But serpents don't have legs." "They did before the fall," she asserted with perfect confidence. Haven apparently described the walking snake on one of the mounted fragments, although she said it was from another roll. This creates a problem for Milstein, so he argues that she is describing scenes that are not on any of the extant papyri. However, she seems to have combined in her memory the image of the walking snake with the tripod-looking baboon adoring the rising sun, which someone copied onto a folded sheet, probably about July 1835, from a badly damaged portion of Ta Sheret Min's Book of the Dead, which now can be seen as fragments glued in the upper left corner of Joseph Smith Papyrus 9. This raises the question as to what Haven actually saw and the reliability of her memory. Regardless, Haven provides another example of a witness describing the fragments as if they were complete scrolls. Milstein's next witness, Benjamin Ashby, was 15 years old when he saw the papyri in November 1843. He later recalled in his autobiography that he and his mother visited Lucy Smith, and that she exhibited the mummies from which the Book of Abraham was taken, as well as the original papyrus on which it was written. From this, Milstein argues, it is not fully clear, but it appears that his reference to the original papyrus refers to the long roll as the source, since he does not mention frames or slides, as is typical when they were exhibited. Besides being an argument from silence, Milstein's statement is astounding, given that Ashby's account was made many decades later and is so vague. Ashby wrote papyrus, not roll or scroll. There's nothing in his statement that can be construed as meaning what Milstein represents. That is, that Ashby seems to indicate that the long roll, rather than the mounted fragments, was the original source. Milstein is hearing what he wants to hear. Ashby is another non-witness. An observer, identified only as M, visited Lucy Smith in 1846 and soon after reported. She produced a black-looking roll, which she told us was papyrus, found on the breast of the king, part of which the prophet had unrolled and read, and she had pasted the deciphered sheets on the leaves of a book, which she showed us. This was likely a scrapbook with the published Book of Abraham from the Times and Seasons pasted inside. The anonymous reporter continues. The roll was as dark as the bones of the mummies and bore very much the same appearance, but the open sheets were exceedingly like thin parchment and of quite a light color. There were birds, fishes, and fantastic-looking people interspersed amidst hieroglyphics. From this interview with Lucy Smith, more than a year after her son's death, Milstein argues, we learn that the prophet had only unrolled and deciphered part of the roll. The fact that Lucy Mack Smith had a translation of what was on the scroll indicates that she thought the Book of Abraham came from that scroll, not the mounted fragments, though the account is not completely clear on this. While Milstein tries to take advantage of an unclear source his interpretation is not based on a careful reading. Unrolling and reading part of the papyrus is a description of what Joseph Smith did in the past, not a comment about the current location of what he read. When Joseph Smith unrolled the first part of the papyrus and read it, it was at least 2 years before the opening portions of the papyrus were mounted. In this source, the part of the papyrus that was unrolled is parallel with opened sheets, which Muhlestein assumes refers to the mounted fragments. The source clearly states that Joseph Smith translated the first part of the scroll, not the last part as Guy and Muhlestein maintain. Muhlstein's assertion that Mother Smith described the long scroll as the source of the Book of Abraham is therefore not based on a careful reading of this account. Muhlestein also notes that the anonymous observer described seeing birds, fishes, and fantastic-looking people, and that we have no depictions of fish, from which he infers that the Book of Abraham was on the long scroll, not the mounted fragments. However, this source describes what was seen on the open sheets, not on the roll. There may very well have been a fish on a missing fragment, but it is entirely possible that the observer was mistaken, since he was describing from memory what he had seen. Muhlestein has given us another non-witness. Muhlestein demonstrates his desperation to produce evidence for his missing papyrus theory when he refers to the 1922 reminiscence of Hyrum Smith's granddaughter, Jerusha W. Blanchard, who said she used to hide in the old cabinet that held the mummies in the 1850s when she was about 5 years of age. In recounting her childhood memories, she described the mummies. There were 3 mummies: the old Egyptian king, the queen, and their daughter. The bodies were wrapped in 7 layers of linen cut in thin strips. In the arms of the old king lay the roll of papyrus from which our prophet translated the Book of Abraham. It seems doubtful that the roll was still lying in the arms of the male mummy in the 1850s, so it may be that what she meant to say was that the roll containing the Book of Abraham once lay in his arms. Still, while we do not know if her statement was based on an assumption, or if she was imperfectly repeating what her great-grandmother Lucy Mack Smith had told her, which would have been the same as what she told Charlotte Haven, that the scroll contained the writing of Abraham. Regardless, because Blanchard was 6 years old in 1856 when Lucy Smith died, and the mummies and papyri were sold to Abel Combs, and her statement was given 56 years later, her statement provides no meaningful support for Muhlstein's and Guy's missing papyrus theory. In 1898, Joseph Smith III, Joseph and Emma Smith's son, born in 1832, and the president of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now known as the Community of Christ, related what he knew about the mummies and papyri. Among other things, he said, "The papyrus from which the Book of Abraham was said to have been translated by a father was with other portions found in a roll with some Egyptian mummies, pasted on either paper or linen and put into a small case of flat drawers, some dozen or 16 in number. Part of the stock, 1 case of mummies, and part or all of the cases of drawers found their way into the Woods Museum in Chicago, and a part to St. Louis, where we never learned. I personally, in company with Elder Elijah Banta of Sandwich, Illinois, saw the mummies in Chicago before the Great Fire in 1871, in which they undoubtedly perished with the rest of the accumulated relics and curiosities." According to Muhlestein, Joseph Smith III considered the papyri that burned in the Great Chicago Fire to be the source of the Book of Abraham, not the papyri that remains. Joseph Smith III does not specify that the long roll was the source of the Book of Abraham, but does indicate that it was papyrus we no longer have. This is a completely erroneous interpretation of what Joseph Smith III said. He clearly states that the papyrus that produced the Book of Abraham was glued to either paper or linen and kept in a small case of flat drawers, and he never mentions an intact scroll going to any museum or seeing one in Chicago. He only mentions the mounted sheets in the case of drawers. Joseph III assumed part or all the cases of drawers containing the source of the Book of Abraham followed the mummies to the Chicago Museum and were destroyed in the fire, but so did everyone else. Clearly, Joseph Smith III's statement does not support the Guy-Meulstein theory that the Book of Abraham came from the long roll rather than the mounted fragments. Quite the opposite. When one sees just how weak Meulstein's and Guy's evidence is, it is shocking to see Meulstein so confidently declare,
anyone who tells you that Joseph Smith is translating from the text around facsimile 1 on the small fragment that we have is just flying in the face of the historical accounts that tell us the source is the long scroll.
Despite this confidence, in the conclusion to his 2016 essay in the Journal of Mormon History, Meulstein seems to acknowledge the weakness of his use of sources when he states, while not every account is fully clear, the united voice of the whole confirms that the long roll was the source of the Book of Abraham. This is the only scenario that can reconcile all the accounts. Actually, when all the accounts are taken together, it is more accurate to say that the aggregate of the sources dictates that the long roll is the source for Joseph Smith's inspiration as he revealed the Book of Abraham. This is utter nonsense, for scholarship or source criticism doesn't work this way. Weak and misinterpreted sources, no matter how many, do not produce good evidence. Meulstein admits that Lumen Shurtleff and William I. Appleby do not indicate anything one way or the other as to the source of the Book of Abraham, though they do provide valuable clues. Then, Meulstein states, the accounts of Henry Tressler, Benjamin Ashby, and the anonymous M indicate that the long scroll was the source of the Book of Abraham, though it is possible to interpret them other ways. Finally, Meulstein asserts, two of the accounts that are clear about the source of the Book of Abraham, Charlotte Haven and Jerusha Blanchard, both agree that it came from the long roll. However, as I have clearly shown, this assertion is based on a misreading and mishandling of these sources. Meulstein and Guy have no real evidence to support their argument that the Book of Abraham came from the long roll and not the mounted fragments. The sources they use were not created to answer the fine-pointed question Meulstein and Guy wish to answer with them. The only people who might have known the answer to the question of where on the papyrus Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham from were W. W. Phelps, Warren Parrish, and Frederick G. Williams, and their documents use characters from the Breathing Permit of Hor, not from an allegedly missing long roll. Instead, Guy and Meulstein tried to replace this testimony with a parade of non-witnesses, which they often misrepresent.
As previously mentioned, some Mormon scholars want to claim Joseph Smith received the Book of Abraham through revelation and that he mistakenly believed it came from the Hor Papyrus. This theory raises several questions. How does one explain the two references in the text to facsimile 1? This is a serious problem, especially since those references were made at the time of dictation and not inserted later. How is it that the Hor Papyrus, which admittedly has nothing to do with Abraham and was written many centuries later, just happened to have a representation of the altar and gods referenced by Abraham? All Joseph Smith had to do was add the knife. How convenient. While scholars can't determine whether or not the Book of Abraham came by revelation, the suggestion that Joseph Smith mistakenly believed his dictation of the text came from the papyrus doesn't fit the evidence. There's too much deception to be explained away in this fashion. As discussed in the previous videos, Joseph Smith was responsible for the translation of specific characters in the Ketumen passages in the valuable Discovery notebooks, Egyptian alphabets, as well as the bound grammar. This can't be brushed aside as Joseph Smith's working things out in his mind. This was pretending to translate on a massive scale. Some of these ideas made their way into the Book of Abraham as translation of characters Joseph Smith invented, such as the discovery of Egypt while it was still under water by Egyptus. Moreover, the characters in the margins next to Joseph Smith's dictated text were not placed there for ornamentation, but the awkward division and lining up of the English text with the characters strongly suggests a translation of those characters. There is a better theory the apologists should consider, a theory suggested by the text of the Book of Abraham itself. At the end of the second chapter, which was dictated by Joseph Smith in Nauvoo in 1842, the familiar story of Abraham asking Sarah to tell the Egyptians that she is his sister instead of his wife in order to save his life is changed to God telling Abraham to tell Sarah to lie to the Egyptians. The belief that God sometimes inspires the use of deception to accomplish the greater good is a very useful belief for a pseudepigraphist. Religious forgery has a long history. From the fake discovery of the Book of Deuteronomy in the ruins of the temple in the 7th century BCE, to the many pseudepigraphic writings like the Assumption of Moses, the Book of Enoch, and the Ascension of Isaiah, generally dating from 200 BCE to CE 200, to the many forgeries of the medieval monks and clerics, and finally, as I maintain, to the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham. The motivation for these pseudonymous authors, explains New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, was to give their own religious views, often deemed heretical by the dominant group of believers, respectability and authority that otherwise would not be given a contemporary author. The Book of Abraham attempted to lend ancient support to several of Joseph Smith's doctrinal innovations not clearly mentioned in the Bible, such as a line of high priests among the ancient patriarchs, origin of the black race and preservation of the curse through the flood, plurality of gods, and the pre-existence of humankind. Joseph Smith may have sincerely believed these ideas, but he may have also believed he was authorized by God to use deception to convince others to believe them as well. I'm Dan Vogel. As always, thanks for watching.